we just talk about various different kinds of metrics, give an overview, just a kind of a brief introduction, and then some places where you can go if you want to find out more information. So yeah, that's the plan for today. So let's get cracking then. So here we go. So yeah, I don't know how you feel when you hear the word metrics, whether it's more like the left picture or whether you feel a bit more like the right one where you think, what is this? What's going on? I know quite often I feel probably more like the right-hand picture. But hopefully after today's short session, you'll maybe feel a little bit happier about what metrics are and how they work and what some of the pros and cons of them are, and to maybe give you some ideas of further things to look at after the workshop today. So yeah, I don't know how much you know already about metrics, whether you've come across them before in any different contexts. So you might have seen something like this potentially from a publisher, kind of saying, look, we've got growth in the journal impact factor of our publications. So this is one, I think, from the Institute of Physics back in 2019. In fact, publishers don't tend to do this quite as much as they used to. We might talk a little bit about that, why that could be as we go through the session. But yeah, something like journal impact factor, you might have seen publishers kind of saying, look, we've got these high impact journals. So yeah, what does that mean? Or you might have seen universities. This is not Aberdeen, this is somewhere else. This is just the first one that came up coincidentally when I Googled this, but this was a university that's kind of saying, look, we've got these highly cited researchers. Look, we've got more researchers on the list from our institution this year. Yeah, so what does that mean? Why might universities do that? So you might have seen, yeah, metrics mentioned in this kind of context. Or maybe for individuals, you might have heard things about academics' income or their career progression being affected by their metrics and how well they're cited. And this is a headline from Times Higher Education from a couple of years ago, where somebody done a study estimating that academics' incomes could increase by, what's that, $13,500 potentially for a highly cited paper. So you might have come across it from that kind of angle. Or maybe you've come across something like this before, which occasionally hits the headlines, where you've got researchers and you hear about these various different dubious practices or academic misconduct, researchers trying to kind of artificially boost their metrics. So you might have come across things like this. So this is a particular chemist, I think, who's suspended by his institution. And yeah, at one point he was publishing a study every 37 hours. Do you think, how does anybody even do that? He's obviously trying to boost his metrics, but what does that even mean? Why would somebody do this? How does the way that metrics are set up, how does it kind of incentivize this kind of behavior? So we'll look at some of these things as we go through. But that's just, kind of a little bit of background, some kind of things you might have seen, things you might have come across when you've seen metrics mentioned here and there. So how did we end up here? What does it all mean? So for the rest of the session today, I'm going to look at some different kinds of metrics and how they're used. And then we'll have a think about some limitations of metrics. And then we'll think about how we might use metrics responsibly. So maybe try and avoid some of the issues that we've just talked about. And then I'll give you some pointers for some further information afterwards. We might have a little bit of time possibly for questions as well. And I know I've got some colleagues in the session here today who are experts on metrics who probably know a lot more about this than even I do. So they're on hand as well, so that's great. Okay, so I suppose the fundamental question to begin with is, what are metrics? What on earth are they? So in an academic context, and when we're looking at research metrics, they are basically quantitative measurements designed, as it says here, to evaluate research outputs and their impacts. So this is a definition from UKRI, which is a body that allocates research funding in the UK. So yeah, it's a measure, it's numbers basically, and it's trying to have some kind of objective way of evaluating, research outputs. But it's important to remember that metrics might not just cover research outputs, but there are also metrics that are designed to measure researchers themselves. So it's not just things like articles that we're measuring. There have also been initiatives to measure researchers, like the people themselves, or research groups or institutions potentially as well. So thinking about that, what are the different kinds of metrics and what are they used for? So research metrics have three main focuses typically, and we're going to look at each one of these in turn. So you get metrics which are designed to measure research outputs themselves, so individual outputs. Typically that would be journal articles, research papers, but it could include things like books or book chapters as well, potentially. And then you've got your journal level metrics, which is kind of one level up. So instead of looking at individual papers and articles, it's looking at a journal or a publication as a whole, and trying to kind of work out how impactful that particular publication is. And then you've got, as I mentioned before, metrics that measure researchers. So these ones that measure people, individuals, or measure research groups. So that's looking at the researchers themselves rather than the specific outputs. Okay. So let's look at the article ones to begin with. So here are just a few examples of different kinds of article metrics. We'll look at the first one in a bit more detail as well, but just be aware that citation counts aren't the only thing that can be measured for articles. But you might also measure things like how many times an article is viewed, how many times it's downloaded. Those top three there are basically just quite crude raw figures that give you an idea of how many times either an article has been cited or how many times it's been looked at or read. The two at the bottom there, they're trying to be a little bit more nuanced, and they're trying to get a bit of a kind of subject area or discipline kind of flavor to the metrics. Because as we're going to discuss, these numbers can vary quite a lot depending on the discipline. So if we think about citation counts to begin with, now this is basically, it's pretty much as simple as it sounds. A citation count at its simplest is the number of times a research output has been cited by other researchers in the published literature. So yeah, it is fairly basic number, and it goes up. It's just like a tally counter that goes up every time somebody cites a paper. That gets added to the citation count. So what are the pros and cons of this kind of approach to measuring a paper? Well, from the benefits, it's sort of fairly simple to calculate and fairly easy to understand. If a paper's been cited 10 times, it's fairly easy to comprehend. That means that there are 10 other papers or 10 other works that have cited that particular paper. And you can get a sort of a very rough indication of how impactful a paper is likely to have been based on the number of times that other researchers have cited it. But of course, there are downsides to a citation count as well. It's quite a crude measure. Of course, it's influenced by the age of the paper. So a very new paper is, of course, not going to have anywhere near as many citations as an older paper. So the citation count might just reflect potentially the age of the paper rather than the actual quality of it. As I say there at the bottom, citations are not equal to quality. Just because the paper's got lots of citations doesn't necessarily mean it's good quality. Or it could be older research that maybe was cited a lot when it was published, but it's now been superseded. Or maybe it's just mentioned a lot because it's a really, really bad paper. And people always mention it as a way not to do that particular kind of research, which is just really controversial potentially. So it's not an indicator of quality necessarily. Also varies greatly by discipline. So thinking about the humanities, if you're maybe writing a paper in history, it's probably likely not to be cited as many times as a paper maybe from medical sciences. Maybe it's something about, I don't know, COVID or cancer or something that's obviously probably likely to get a lot more citations than something in a more esoteric area of the humanities. And even within disciplines, maybe just looking at the medical sciences, if you're researching maybe a very rare disease or a disorder that maybe is more prevalent in the global south rather than somewhere in the global north, it might not get the same kind of traction, same number of citations as a paper that's researching a more common disease or something where there's a lot more kind of maybe commercial or research interest in that particular area. And something else to bear in mind as well, it varies greatly by the database, because obviously somebody has to measure the number of citations. You might have a database like Scopus that's tracking citations in other articles, and that'll give you a certain figure, but you might look in a different database or a different place, somewhere like Google Scholar, and it might think there's a different number of citations for that particular article. And Google Scholar is quite notorious for having much higher citation counts than other databases. So if researchers want to make themselves look more impactful, they can give their citation count from Google Scholar rather than from something like Scopus, because it's a bigger number. So yeah, various downsides potentially there with our citation counts. So yeah, we could also look at some journal level metrics. So this is going up a level, so not looking at individual articles, but looking at the publications themselves. The most common one that you've probably come across is the journal impact factor, but there are other ones that exist as well. So just a few examples there, not an exhaustive list by any means, but yeah, these are some different journal level metrics. And as before, some of them are quite crude numbers, and other ones that they're kind of a bit more refined, where they try to rank by subject area or do various statistical little tricks to try and make it more consistent, a bit more meaningful. So those are the ones we've got there. And let's look at journal impact factor in a little bit more detail, because that's probably the one you're most likely to come across. This is one of the ones that's been in use for the longest time, so it's one of the more common ones, and one of the ones that people tend to use more often. So the way this is calculated, see if I can explain this in a way that makes sense, but it's basically the average number of citations received in a given year for articles in the journal that were published in the preceding 2 years. So let's say the journal impact factor for 2023 for a journal, that would they would calculate that by looking at all the articles that were published in 2021 and 2022, and then they'd take those articles and they'd see how many citations did they get in the calendar year of 2023, and that average number of citations will be the journal's impact factor for that particular year. So obviously that can change year on year, and as the journal evolves and publishes different things, or maybe gets more subscribers or fewer subscribers or whatever, you can see how the impact factor might change as we go through time. It's worth knowing as well that this measure was initially developed by a publisher, Claravit, and it was originally designed as a tool for librarians to manage journal subscriptions. So it wasn't originally intended as a way of other researchers kind of deciding the quality of the journal. It really was initially a way for librarians to decide whether something was worth subscribing to. It's just been taken, and it's got a life beyond what it was originally designed for. Again, what are the pluses and minuses when we look at journal impact factors? So again, on the positives, it's a fairly quick and easy indication of the average number of citations for articles appearing in a publication. So it's going to give you a very rough idea of whether a journal, whether the articles there are likely to get highly cited or not. And so another advantage of this one is it's familiar. It's been in use for many years. So you can track the history of a journal. People are also familiar with how it works. So people generally understand what you mean if you talk about journal impact factor. But again, it's a fairly crude measure, and there are issues with the journal impact factor. Some of them may be quite obvious, some of them may be less so. Again, it varies greatly by discipline because it's based on citations, and it's going to vary depending on what your subject area is. You'll notice as well it was looking at a 2-year time frame for calculating that figure, which is fairly short of a time frame, really. Maybe not so much so for an area of the sciences, maybe that's moving very quickly. But if you're in a discipline where it takes maybe quite a while for things to get published, for citations to build up, 2 years could be really no time at all for something to get cited. So the impact factor is very likely to be low because you're just looking at such a short time period. As well, it doesn't reflect the variation in the number of citations within a particular journal. So quite often you'll have journals that'll have a few really high impacts or really highly cited articles, and that can skew the average by a huge amount. You'll have a very long tail maybe of articles that don't have very many citations at all. So it might not really give you a particularly good idea of the average article in that journal, how likely it is to be cited, because there could be so much variation within an individual title. And perhaps the majority of articles will only be cited maybe once or twice, and there'll just be a few kind of whales or whatever that have massive numbers of citations that are kind of skewing everything. And as I keep saying as well, citations does not necessarily equal quality for all the reasons that I mentioned before. So let's have a look quickly now at author metrics. So these are some things that are designed to measure the researchers themselves. The most commonly used one, the one that you're most likely to have heard of, is what we call the H-index, that one at the top there. But there are some other versions of that there. There are issues with the H-index, and people have tried to kind of modify it a little bit to maybe make it a bit more accurate. So you've got things like the G-index and the M-index, and then there's the author impact factor there as well. But they work in very similar ways, just with certain tweaks. to how they calculate the figure. Let's again look at the most popular one there, the H-index. Originally, this was used in, I think it was theoretical physics or physics, I think. It could have been computing, I'm forgetting, but anyway, it was originally researchers in the sciences who this was designed for. And the way this is calculated, it looks for the number of publications where an author has been cited by other authors at least that same number of times. And that may not doesn't make very much sense, but if you've got an an H-index of say 5, that means that the researcher has got at least 5 papers that have been cited at least 5 times. And I've got a graph here. I don't know if this makes it any clearer or not. Once you get it, it kind of makes sense, but it is a bit difficult to explain. But you see here, there's a plot of somebody who's got different publications. So their number of papers is on the x-axis there. You've got the number of citations on the vertical y-axis. So you can see there's some papers there that have got a large number of citations. And then as we go down, there are some that don't have quite so many. And we've got that 45-degree line that's going through there. So that's where the 45-degree line crosses the curve of the publication papers. That figure there will be what our H-index was, or to the nearest whole number. So this person has had H papers published that have had H citations. Okay, hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Is a bit difficult to explain, but once you get it, it's fairly straightforward to understand. Okay, and again, this is a fairly simple way of calculating a metric. You'll have noticed from the graph, it's not affected by papers that have abnormally high or low citations. So if researchers got a very small number of papers that have got loads of citations, or small number that have got very few citations, I mean, it kind of averages itself out with the metric there. And you can also use this for groups of researchers as well as for individuals. But coming on to our caveats, of course, it's going to be influenced by the career length of the researcher. So the more articles they publish, obviously, the more opportunity they then have to have a higher H-index. Again, as with the others, it varies by discipline as to how quickly researchers can put out articles, as to how many citations they're likely to get. So if you were trying to compare authors from different disciplines, it's going to be quite difficult. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but it is actually quite an inconsistent and unintuitive measure. If you look at how it actually works, if you tweak figures, it doesn't behave in quite the way you might expect it to. And there are papers that look at this. So it's maybe not quite as intuitive as you might think it is on first glance. You might have a researcher who's got maybe a small number of very impactful papers. They might be really well known in their field. They could have had a huge impact, but because maybe they have quite a lot of other papers that haven't had a lot of citations, or they just haven't published a huge number of papers, their H-index could actually be quite low, maybe lower than somebody else who's maybe published more, but who hasn't had that same kind of total impact as the previous person. And as with everything else, it's based on citations and they're not necessarily an indicator of quality. So let's quickly go through some of the other stuff, because I'm aware we've not got a huge amount of time. So you'll might have picked up that those things that we've looked at is looking at more traditional kinds of citations in other academic publications mostly. But impact could be felt outside of that kind of traditional academic publishing landscape. So things might be reproduced a lot on social media, things might appear in the news. Research could be used in a practical way by specific companies or organizations or NGOs or whatever that might not be picked up in the number of citations that they get in academic literature. So there are altmetrics and other measures as well that people might use to get an idea of how things are being received outside of traditional academic circles. So that's another kind of metric that people might talk about. Okay, so what's some of the limitations? Very quickly, let's go through these. One of them, I don't know if you've come across something called the McNamara fallacy, but this is basically when you focus on making numbers the sole basis of your decision making. You don't really look at context, you don't think about other things, because you think, oh, it's objective, it's figures, they don't lie. But this can often, lead to issues, because the numbers don't give us the full picture, and they can be misleading without the context. So yeah, and particularly with metrics, you end up often with a focus on quantity over quality, and they give us that kind of sense that we're doing something scientific because it's based on numbers, but we would forget about the context that those numbers are generated in, and how reliable or not they might be, and how comparable they are between different people or across different disciplines. And they don't obviously give us the full picture. They lack nuance, they lack context. As you've seen before, some of them are quite crude measures, really, of impact. They're not giving us the full picture. Something else that you might have thought about, and that came up particularly with that headline that we had before about the researcher who was publishing all those papers every few hours, is what we call Goodhart's law, and that states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, and that is because metrics can be gamed, or people can manipulate them for their own purposes. So there can be all kinds of questionable things that might be just slightly dubious, right through to things which are outright fraudulent that people do to artificially boost the publication or citation rates. So that might be things that publishers do that are maybe a bit questionable. There are things like front matter in journals that can be cited that's not academic articles, but it can still help to increase the journal impact factor. There might be issues with the peer reviewing process potentially. There may be journals that try to get the peer review process maybe done really quickly, maybe so they can publish more, so they can have a figure maybe on their journal page that says, our peer review is quick, it takes such and such a time, makes them look like they're efficient when maybe it's just because they're not being maybe so thorough. Of course, this gives a disincentive as well for people to publish null results or replication studies, and because they're not so likely to be cited, it means the impact factor is going to be maybe negatively impacted if you've got studies that aren't going to get a huge number of citations. So that can skew the literature that's published. Or you might get, authors maybe citing papers by people they think might be reviewing the paper to try and get a more favourable outcome for their review process potentially. So something else that could potentially happen. Issues for researchers as well. They might publish what we call salami slice research, so putting things into as many different publications as possible. Various different issues here. You can read these: excessive self-citation, citation bias could be an issue, where they're maybe citing research that just backs up their particular point of view, not citing confounding research, and you can see how that could, over time, that could skew the impact of certain researchers or certain kinds of research, and lead to a skewing of what's considered to be impactful in a particular discipline. And other kinds of malpractice and outright fraud, like data falsification, and people trying to make papers that are impactful, so maybe falsifying results or just overstating their findings to try and increase the number of citations. So what can we do about this? We really need to be using metrics responsibly. They do have uses, but we've got to be very careful in the way that we approach them. So one way that we could do that is by using the principles of the Leiden Manifesto. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's a link there if you want to find out more. So this was proposed by academics back in 2015, and it gives principles for using metrics responsibly. And similarly, we've got the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, also known as DORA. The University of Aberdeen is a signatory to this. And again, you can go on to Toolkit here. You can find out more about DORA and what that means for academics and researchers here at the university. But these are some of the key principles to be aware of to use metrics responsibly. So we've got here, robustness, humility. So that's humility might sound a slightly odd word, but that means making sure that metrics aren't the sole basis of how we make decisions, that we're also supplementing those with other kinds of evidence. We're not just solely relying on these kind of flawed measures and numbers. Transparency, so it's clear how we've come to our evaluation, and other people can go back and look at what we've done and see how we came to a particular decision, or verify the results that we've come to. Accounting for diversity within disciplines, maybe not just using maybe just H-index because it can vary so much across disciplines, not having a one-size-fits-all for everybody, but using different indicators and different methods to reflect the diversity of different kinds of researchers across different disciplines, different stages in their career, maybe as well people who have different ways that they research, taking into account all those different things, people's different and personal circumstances as well, and also recognizing that because metrics can be gamed, we need to respond to the systemic effects that metrics can have on the academic landscape. We've only got like a minute or so left, so if we quickly run through these, there are different things that we can do as researchers as well. So I'll just quickly flash these up on the screen. These are on the website as well. There are some links I can give you as well to read about this from our open research pages. But yeah, making judgments based on scientific content rather than relying on metrics there, particularly around decisions around funding, recruitment and promotion. Something else that we do is to cite primary literature to make sure that people are getting the credit where it's due for the research that they've done. Using range of metrics and indicators, so not just relying on a single measure or a single metric, but making sure we got that diversity and we got the whole picture rather than just relying on a single number. And also, there might be an action that's on us to challenge practices that we see which are relying inappropriately on things like the journal impact factor, and to make sure that in the work that we do in the teaching, in our interactions with other people, that we're using metrics responsibly and calling out instances when that's not the case. Okay, so we've come up to quarter two. Thanks so much for listening to me babble on. Sorry, that was a bit of a rush through, but we've got more information there if you want to find out more. We've got that page on research metrics, or you can contact our open research team, and that's the email address just there. So I hope